Galeotti, it's so lovely to have you with me again. One of the things that I love about your work, and I often talk about this with my community, is not just your remarkable book output, but your capacity to responsibly commentate on issues as they are developing. And I've often had the radio on, something has happened, and 4 hours later, Mark Galeotti is on and he's explaining it. But he's explaining it without ever seducing irresponsibly me, the audience, into premature conclusions or into wishful thinking. The kind of wishful thinking that we so often see in YouTube thumbnails about Putin's imminent collapse. If it's not tomorrow, it's going to be the day after. I'd love to just hear a bit about how you balance this, because it's something that I think about an enormous amount in my own communication with the culture. How do you balance the ethics of this? So how do you do it? Does it come naturally? Do you create some sort of boundaries and filters for yourself? How does this all work for you?
Yes, I mean, does it come naturally? I don't know. I'm monstrously arrogant, like most people who choose to put themselves out there. But on the other hand, first of all, one has to acknowledge that we're going to get things wrong, always, and sometimes really dangerously. I mean, look, I will be honest. Until about a week before the invasion, back in February 2022, I didn't think that Putin would, because it just seemed so damn stupid. And indeed it was. But my assumption had been that Putin was more rational, or perhaps rather better informed than he really was. And, so we all can sit there and make our calculations about what we think is going on, but we always have to have a keen awareness of the fact that we are fallible. And this is, I think, particularly important, and this is my second point, is we live in an era that is deeply intolerant of any kind of equivocation. We are being expected, whether it's when a journalist rings up or even from an audience sort of online or whatever, they want to have clarity in what is, after all, an exceedingly kind of complex world. A world in which we are being bombarded by everything that's happening all around the globe in a way that, in the past we never would. And people want it to be encapsulated. People want to understand it. And we are also in an environment in which there is a market for explainers. And how do you actually convey to someone, it's worth listening to me, even though I don't necessarily have the answer? When there's someone else on the next YouTube channel along, or the next podcast, who is going to speak with absolute confidence, absolute clarity, and make the reality so much simpler and so much easier to grasp. And I think the answer to that is precisely that you have to almost take the audience along with you, and not be shy about expertise and the like, but nonetheless say, well, this is what I think, this is why I think it, and these are the evidence bases sometimes. And one can't always say, because sometimes you just say, well, I spoke to some people and the impression I get is X and Y, but at least I can put that out there. And the audience can decide, no, this doesn't sound plausible, or, okay, maybe this is true. But as I said, I mean, in some ways, what you talk about, the gamification, which I think is a sort of a powerful way of thinking about it, it is also about the fact that we now are in an era where, instead of just simply expecting deference to experts' opinions, we as experts are now in some ways having to be deferential to the power of the market. And we have to realise that people will think of themselves as being in a position to pick and choose who they decide to actually pay attention to.
And, one of the things that I've noticed in the last 20 years, even since my own sort of postgraduate and PhD period almost 20 years ago, something has changed. And that is that even in parts of the academy, it's now so much more natural for us to relate a perspective on politics with a moral stance, and a moral stance that goes to the core of my identity. So if Mark Galeotti marginally disagrees with me about the escalation of the Putin regime, this is a direct attack on me. And that just wasn't the case 20 years ago. And I think there's also a kind of consumerist risk for all of us, that we feel that with our time, if not with money, we're buying an opinion, and we only want the opinion that we're paying for with our time. And there's a kind of response I regularly get from some of my audience: Vlad, why aren't you saying the things I want you to say? Almost as if something has backfired in a transaction and somebody is getting a flat white instead of a latte. And algorithmic incentives in this space encourage us to sink deeper in the direction of all of these problems rather than come out of them. But I think that there are two kinds of humans who do better with this. One kind of human is the human who didn't need to make it on social media, the human who predates the last sort of 5 to 10 years of social media, and also the human whose intellectual life is not connected with a particular platform if they're sharing stuff on it. So I don't analyze the world, for instance, to talk about it in a YouTube video. Now, it happens that my current output, in part for health reasons, is almost exclusively YouTube output. But that distinction is very important for me, because I see people who think to then speak on YouTube, who think thoughts in order to say them on YouTube, for instance. And I see this sort of infinitesimal drift, which is never a violation of sincerity, funnily enough. It's not sincerity that goes, it's accuracy, which is that these two parts of truthfulness. You've got to be sincere, but you also got to robustly, unblinkingly try to get the world right. Because part of the marvelousness of the previous conversation we've had, which we'll connect at the back, is that I deliberately wanted to platform your perspectives because they are acceptable, but infinitesimally less popular than the perspective that says that Putin is more readily going to challenge Article 5. And it's incredibly important for my audience to hear that. And it's also incredibly important that I am aware of what these little boxes are that are going to sort of be lapped up too quickly like sugar. And as the thumbnail makers at Times Radio find out, if you talk about the rapid decline of the rapid collapse of the Putin regime, you can really sort of grow your platform that way, even if inside the wrapping you have something slightly less candid. You might have the green vegetables that Mark Galeotti offers, for instance. And of course, what's so challenging here is that experts are caught up in this too. And so what I want to ask you about is how you feel and how complex are your feelings about experts in the Russia-Ukraine war sphere becoming participants and becoming activists simultaneously. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being an activist, but there clearly is an inherent conflict between expertise and activism. So how do you see it? How do you react to it? And how do you sort of, swim about in these waters where, quite frankly, these boundaries are now profoundly blurred?
Yeah, I mean, you've thought about this much more deeply and purposefully than me, and I really felt I ought to have been taking notes, even though I now know that I am essentially the broccoli of Russian analysts. I mean, I think a few points. If I can just sort of pull back a couple of ones. Look, my career has been sort of basically split between academe and think tanks. But I spend a lot of time teaching, and frankly, I enjoy teaching. And even though it makes me feel like a distinctly old fart, I can tell that there has been a shift in student attitudes towards what they're being taught. And one can say that it's to do with tuition fees or whatever else. And certainly I encountered it a lot more when I was at New York University with its massive eye-watering fees. But that sense precisely that if I'm a student and I'm paying money, and as a consumer, it's not just that I expect to be taught well, but I expect to be taught the right things and not exposed to issues, questions, perspectives that challenge my sense of the world. And to me, unfortunately, that is antithetical to what education ought to be about, or education ought to be not willfully for its own purpose, but nonetheless challenging of those and exposing people to other perspectives. And they may well look at them, evaluate them, and then discard them. But at least then they will return to their original perspective, not just simply because it's what they happen to have picked up, but because they have made a conscious and deliberative choice. And I think, unfortunately, that same process has become much broader. And particularly this notion that an expert, an analyst, call them what you will, actually has some kind of moral function. Not to tell the truth as they see it, but to tell the right truth. For example, if we go back to Ukraine, I find it very hard to envisage a situation where in the next, certainly 5 years, Ukraine could ever get back all of the occupied territories, even though I'm fully aware that that is Ukraine's stated government position and also the view of most Ukrainians when they're surveyed on this point. And yet, I find quite often when I say such a thing, I will face pushback from people who are saying, you should not be saying that. You should not be saying that because it's undermining Ukraine's government's perspective, it's encouraging divisiveness or defeatism or whatever. So in other words, you should package your analysis to be saying the right thing. And this speaks to precisely your point about expertise and advocacy. As you say, there is nothing wrong with either. But in some ways, I do think that we should be wearing the right hat. If I'm going to say what I think is wrong with the world and how it should be fixed, I have every right to do so. You have every right to ignore me or whatever. But the point is, I shouldn't be presenting that as anything other than my view. Yes, hopefully, if it's something that I know about, it's an informed and detailed and well-founded view. But nonetheless, it is advocacy. I shouldn't be pretending that it's some kind of semi-objective judgment. All right-thinking people believe that this is what should be done. And I think it's that blurring that has become so dangerous, because it's tempting and exhilarating for the analyst to suddenly feel, no, I have a soapbox. I can tell the world what I think because they should be listening to me. But the flip side of that is, first of all, that people who have opinions think that they also have expertise, which sometimes they do, but many times they don't. But also, in a way, expertise becomes tainted. How far is this what the person actually believes, or is how far what the person wants to believe, or how far is it what the person thinks you want to hear? All of these get sort of muddied up. So I think it's really, when it comes down to it, look, we're all human beings, we're all fallible, we're all going to make mistakes. But nonetheless, the key thing is to be clear, or trying to be clear, firstly with ourselves, and then with our audience, in what capacity we're holding forth.
I speak about expertise, academic expertise, but not only, as in itself a democratic institution, a kind of counter-majoritarian institution that is a check and a balance, among other checks and balances in our societies, because it helps us keep our democracies tethered, at least in a very minimal way, to some kind of institutionally embodied virtue of truthfulness, without which I think we may struggle to sustain our democratic institutions. And so what I say to my community about this, funnily enough, is just that if you support Ukraine, the only way Ukraine's going to get more assistance from the West rather than less is if Western democracies are robust. And for Western democracies to be robust, all the counter-majoritarian institutions in Western democracies have to be as healthy as possible. And academic expertise and disagreement between people who might find each other's perspectives offensive, in that respect, is for the best of all worlds, because unless we keep this democratic show on the road, we can't do anything. Whether you're talking about Ukraine, whether you're talking about the climate crisis. So that's the story I tell my community. But I think that one of the things that you touched on that's very important is this sort of cross-hatted situation, whereby people are either speaking a little bit outside their area of expertise, or people who are speaking within their area of expertise, but are doing so in a much more activist way that may be self-undermining for them. And of course, this brings up the word boundaries and images like staying in your lane. What's your sense of boundaries here if you're talking not to the audience, but to experts? Let's say you're talking to somebody who is a kid who is 25, let's say finishing a PhD, getting out there. What's your advice? If it's somebody who's going to communicate in public and not only produce academic work on political issues of moment?
I mean, the first one is absolutely to try and avoid the initial sugar rush. Because it is, especially, I mean, God, I remember, when I was a youngster, I remember the very first time I got to write something for a newspaper. And, it gives an idea of just how long ago it was The Guardian. And there was no sending, emailing in the text. I was actually reading it to a compositor down the phone. And that's a rush. But the point is that, just to first of all, just take your wide issue about the health of democracy. And yes, the importance, absolutely, of there being robust expertise, and expertise that is interrogated and interrogates itself, within the field. But at the same time, also, we have to notice just how dangerous it is to rely on what we think ought to happen and present that as what will happen. And, if one looks, for example, at the whole debate over sanctions on Russia, one of the issues was that it was massively overplayed at the beginning. People were saying that, within a matter of weeks, the Russian economy was brought to its knees. That was never going to happen. But nonetheless, they were saying so in part for political reasons, to try and push it, and in part because, again, it's what they wanted to hear and what they wanted to say. And that didn't happen. And therefore now you have all sorts of people saying, oh, sanctions have failed, have they not? Well, no, of course not, because sanctions are always going to operate in a different way. They are the grit in the machine of the Russian defence industrial complex rather than anything greater. So, actually we can end up having the very opposite effect of what we might like if we just simply go for what seems to be the right thing to say here and now. So that's the sort of first point. The second point is, and this is harder in an age when academics are being, actually directly rated by their so-called impact. British higher education, which is not in a happy place at the moment, is now subject to all these assessments by metrics, including impact. And this idea that, what is your impact? And it creates a whole culture that basically says exactly, you need to be out there, you need to be writing op-eds, you need to be being interviewed on TV, you need to have lots of followers on Twitter, you need to, etc., etc. So I think in that context, it's a question of, look, speaking to this person who's just finishing a PhD, which in many ways the definition of doing a PhD is you become the world's leading expert in a subject no one else cares about. Fine, you will have a very deep area of expertise, but appreciate where that ends. Precisely, don't try and trade off that, because you will, over time, inevitably build out your expertise. You will then think, oh, here's another project I want to do, and here's a book I want to write, and bit by bit you'll accumulate it. You have not suddenly become the expert in everything. And this applies, across the board. There are people sometimes who say, "Oh, can you come and talk about this aspect of Russia?" And I'm thinking, what do I know about that? I'm by no means a humble soul, but I'm aware of where my expertise is and where it is not. Or in what is a sort of a fascinating kind of inverse imperial assumption, people who ask me to talk about Ukraine when I'm a Russia specialist. Now, I can talk about aspects of Ukraine, organised crime, the security apparatus, the military to a degree. But when they come and ask me to pontificate about high politics and the importance of Yermak as President Zelensky's chief of staff or whatever, I know no more than anyone else who reads the papers and listens to Radio 4 and such like. It's very tempting, though, to take that immediate opportunity and enjoy the sugar rush. It's not good for me. It's not good for the field. It's not good for the people who are listening, who are assuming, oh, Professor Mark Galeotti is going to speak about this, presuming that I know what the hell I'm talking about, rather than just simply I'm sounding plausible as I speak ex cathedra about something I know very little. So, I mean, I think going back to actually sort of answering your question without trying to sound too kind of pompous about it, is precisely to talk to that individual is, what do you want to be? I mean, sometimes people go into academia and PhDs and so forth to hide from the world. Increasingly, though, they don't. They want to actually use their expertise to have some kind of an impact. But do you want to have the right kind of impact? Do you want to debase the whole notion of expertise just for the sake of getting on Radio 4? Or do you actually want to be true to the whole nature of the intellectual process, the intellectual pursuit, which is meant to be about? And finally, again, is this really the world in which you want to live? In which you will want to live for the next decades, and which you want your kids to live? One in which basically, everyone who either just sounds plausible or has the appropriate letters in front or behind their name can speak out as if they have authority when they may not have the knowledge to back that authority. Because when it comes down to it, it's all very well us fulminating about all those other people, those terrible people on YouTube or whatever, who aren't doing it properly. But it starts with us doing it properly.
I think one element that I think is very important for me is this notion of giving something that is digestive, that is digestively healthy. And my definition of that is, how does the person in whose tummy you've put that thing feel the next day about it, and not on the spot? And relatedly, there's an idea of the aspirational here, because we so often just return to people a more intensified version of the view they want to hear. Mm-hmm. But people have different sides. And, when you were talking about the tragedy of Ukraine losing its territory and the reality that there's no realistic short-term prospect of it being regained, certainly my audience on YouTube gets it. I mean, if we polled them, probably 80% would say, yeah, I see that. But I think that they would also be open to wishful thinking in many cases if they weren't exposed to people challenging that and people telling them to keep two things in mind at the same time, because they can, that there's something that would be good if it happened, but that it may not happen in reality. But then I think to experts, I often recommend having an understanding that there isn't going to be a clear-cut line often about where you should or shouldn't go. And that requires almost a little sort of a filtering station where you can take time, where you can refresh yourself, because not all decisions are clear. I mean, it's absolutely clearly within my expertise to talk about John Stuart Mill's conception of liberty. Now, is it then also okay for me to talk about whether Trump is going to win and how stable the Putin regime is? Well, if I clearly label myself as a political philosopher who's commentating on a limited number of bits of the world, then perhaps I don't have academic expertise in anything Russia-related. But I have been making sort of private notes on the Putin regime since the 90s, on a sort of a weekly basis, and I deeply understand what you know that I don't. I'm not gonna be naive about that, and that's very important to me. And so I might say, well, yes, I can discuss the stability of the Putin regime with a degree of expertise, especially if I lean towards broader questions, like how authoritarian regimes persist and so on. But obviously, I'm not going to go on radio and talk about Prigozhin's organization. I mean, that would be absolutely ludicrous. But it's not a sharp distinction, as it's not a sharp distinction about how much you can advocate for the side that you want to win, especially if it's your side, right? We don't want Putin to be the man who decides security arrangements in Europe. We want, ourselves to be deciding that. But how far can we go, right? How far can we support Ukraine overtly, right? I mean, my position is, just very briefly, that I stop short of ever identifying with the Ukrainian side, or of ever recommending that people practically support Ukraine, even though I know a lot of my community does, and I'm proud of them for doing that. But I would never recommend that, because I reserve the right to wake up tomorrow and say, I'm interested in democratic decline in the West. It has now become true that it's counterproductive for us from now on to support Ukraine going forward. And the power lies in the fact that I'm not saying that, but I could. And so the power of my pro-Ukrainian position in part comes from the fact that I reserve this right for myself. Now, I would lose a part of my audience, but I'd be happy to. If that was my view, I just would lose it. So it's this question of the boundaries of positive support and identification too. Could be with Ukraine, could be just with Kamala Harris, So it's boundaries, right? And there is not a clear line.
There isn't a clear line. I mean, those in sometimes there are these sort of shibboleths. There's these things. I mean, for example, I was once taken to task for not using or not launching into a particular discussion of the war with Slava Ukraini as a token of my support. And look, it's not that actually this is because I'm secretly hoping that Putin will crush and bring the rebellious Ukrainians to heel. It's that I'm unwilling to accept the notion that one has to have public declarations of loyalty, of being on the right side. It's a little bit like wearing a poppy. I will often wear a poppy, but it's not that I think, well, look, if one doesn't, then one clearly actually is spitting on the memories of all of those who have fallen in the two world wars. It is this thing about sort of loyalty tests, which unfortunately has kind of crept in. But another point, when it comes down to it, we are all free to comment on whatever we want to comment. But again, it's this point of actually flagging up on what basis we're doing so. And one of the things I've done, I mean, obviously I kind of, I listen to and watch all sorts of different people's podcasts and videos and such like, including ones of people whose views I passionately disagree with, but because one has to at least admit the possibility that they might actually have something worth saying. The thing that has struck me is how rarely we get the phrases like, I think, I believe, it seems to me. And yes, because it feels like it weakens what you're saying. It's much better just simply to make it as a declaratory statement. Putin believes this. That's short, punchy, powerful, and quite possibly entirely misleading. And again, I think this is something that we actually have to, I don't want to say police ourselves, but, actually be aware. You talk about the filters. Well, I think actually a lot of it is linguistic filtering, that we have to be careful how we speak. Because yes, we are all performing when we do these kind of interventions. And one way or the other, we want to connect to an audience. We want people to probably to like us, but at the very least to be interested in what we have to say. And to that end, it is very tempting to use particular approaches and formulations. That's also often very dangerous, though. Again, it's this question of the audience may well want us. I mean, obviously, different audience get curated in different ways. I mean, I think your community is the very fact that they follow you is precisely because not they're simply that they want a quick hit of what's going on in Russia or whatever, but they want to be part of the debate and the discussion and that whole voyage of discovery in some ways, about how one thinks about and talks about various issues. So in some ways that's a sort of already a kind of a certain encapsulated community. But if we're just talking about generally, you're reaching out to the random audience out there. It is tempting just to be authoritative and positive, and yes, ideally say the things that they want to hear and so forth. But in the process, you're traducing yourself and your expertise.
Failing to hold your audience, right, to whom you are, enormously responsible. Because speaking of hats, I tend to think of the very idea of a very public kind of expertise as requiring a somewhat different hat to an expertise that just happens within a community of academic literature or university. Because for me, my philosopher hat is all about truthfulness, which is different to knowing what's true, because that's a process and an aspiration. But with public communication, YouTube and the infinitesimal amount of radio and TV I've done, it's how do I contribute to anyone listening having a more unobstructed relationship with truthfulness. That's a little bit different with just telling them what I think is true. It often means, for instance, gently trying to tilt people away from superficially reassuring prejudices that they know deep down aren't as nourishing as having, a confrontation with something slightly more complex and slightly more challenging. And so for me, that sense of accountability to somebody receiving what I'm putting into them has an enormous weight. I literally feel it like a bit of a physical object that I carry around, and I'm always exploring how can I do better? How can I stop doing something that I think is less constructive, and so on. And it's almost like a little sort of thing that whirs somewhere above my head, and it always constitutes growth for me. So I feel I am less bad. I'm still really bad, and I call myself a 12-year-old public intellectual. But I'm always conscious that it's important to make progress, always grow in relation to these delicate boundaries that we're talking about staying in your lane, your area of expertise, and also about distinguishing between interpreting the world, right, and then trying to sort of fantasize about where you want the world to go. And one of the things that is so effortless about speaking with you, Mark, is that you never insist that the things that you think are true are obviously true. And I'm enormously sympathetic to that attitude, because very often the people with whom I feel most alien aren't people who think something different to me, but actually people who think what I think, but only I don't think it's obvious, but they think that it is. And that's actually a very big gulf. And especially when we're talking about interpreting the machinations of the Putin regime, that concession that we're offering an interpretation that we think is true, but that it's a dramatic stretch to call it obvious, is really important, and of course also goes a long way toward building trust. But we're battling uphill, right, all the time against algorithms and against the informational environment.
But this point you say about obvious, I mean, let's be honest, obvious is a kissing cousin of all right-thinking people agree. It's actually a way of trying to squeeze out the scope for any kind of alternative perspective. And in that case, I mean, I think broadly, what you're talking about is really often, I would suggest it's a difference between respecting and pleasing your audience. Now, one hopes that the audience is pleased by being respected, but in some ways that's a pleasing byproduct rather than anything else. actually just simply feeding your audience what they would like. Again, to go back to your kind of digestive metaphor, fine, that's an infinite supply of Smarties. And that's very nice, and it's colourful, and it's very pleasant. But after a certain point, it's really not good for you. But there and then, people like Smarties.
Mark, I think this is a wonderful point at which to end. And if you want to see my discussion with Mark about the prospects of the Putin regime escalating and how one should respond to the debate around Putin potentially getting into a conflict with NATO, watch this video next.